Welcome to Kikar, Conversations in the Jewish Public Square, brought to you by the Jewish Leadership Conference. My name is Jonathan Silver, and I want to get to today's conversation with Elliott Abrams about Israel, Hamas, and Gaza. But before we get started, I want to tell you about who we are at the Jewish Leadership Conference, and explain why we believed it was necessary to launch a new podcast, even in such a crowded marketplace. We began to grow concerned about the state of Jewish culture and politics in both America and Israel. Most American Jews lean to the left politically, and there are understandable historical reasons for that attachment. But we grew alarmed at the extent to which progressive political commitments were simply displacing traditional Judaism. We saw prominent members of the American Jewish community arguing, sometimes with great passion and power, against Jewish interests in Israel and the diaspora. Anti-Semitism, politics organized against the Jews, seemed to enjoy a new breath of life, sometimes cloaked as anti-Zionism, sometimes as just old-fashioned Jew hatred. College campuses seemed to have turned against Israel and Jewish traditionalism, betraying the intellectual premises of the freedom of speech and thought on which so many of the best institutions of higher education were founded. Religious freedom, a freedom cherished as a matter of American consensus, was being systematically reconceptualized as a partisan tactic in a revitalized culture war, a war that would not end well for the Jewish community. So yeah, we were concerned, and we attempted an experiment. The experiment was to host a series of conversations at a major conference in New York on the topic of Jews and conservatism. Would anyone come? Was the Jewish community ready to revisit old ways of thinking and begin new conversations about public affairs? The answer was yes, by the hundreds. People came from more than 20 American states. People came from Canada and Mexico and Israel. They came to listen to arguments, to meet each other, to assume their share of responsibility for the Jewish future. Can Jewish ideas renew American society and the nations of the West? Can politics strengthen the American Jewish community? And is it time for Jewish Americans to rethink the policies that we support and the political figures that claim to have our best interests at heart? How did Jewish students and non-Jewish friends of Israel become the objects of harassment and activist aggression on campus? How does knowledge of Jewish history encourage gratitude for the freedoms of the United States, and in particular, compel us to stand up for the religious freedom of all Americans? These were some of the questions that we posed last year, and the seriousness with which people took those questions, and the sheer number of women and men who raised their hands to want to help to lead the Jewish people in the public arena was impressive. We're organizing another conference again this year, and I hope many listeners to Kikar will register to join us at jewishleadershipconference.org. But we want to keep these conversations going, and we think it's time to embolden Jewish commitments in and Jewish contributions to the public square. That's why we're holding these conferences, and that's why I'm launching Kikar as a forum for discussions with intellectuals, scholars, rabbis, and writers, Jewish communal leaders, soldiers, jurists, and political figures. Welcome. This week, as rockets again fly from Gaza into Israel, we launched the first episode of Kikar with an investigation of the purpose and moral obligations of Jewish power in the Jewish state. In late March 2018, Hamas became involved in organizing a series of weekly demonstrations at Israel's border with Gaza. These protests, the Great March of Return, culminated in a large-scale demonstration on the Israeli border on May 14th, timed to coincide with the moving of America's embassy to Jerusalem. The IDF's defense of Israel's border successfully prevented Hamas infiltration, but Israel's targeted killing of some 60 Palestinians, 50 of whom were soon claimed by Hamas as its operatives, was loudly and roundly criticized by Israel's enemies. In many respects, the events of mid-May follow an established media pattern, but there are several things beyond the media narrative that should claim our attention. What strategy is Hamas deploying in its Great March of Return? What does Israel's response to Hamas in Gaza signal to Israel's regional adversaries and allies? And perhaps most important of all, but missing from so much of the analysis of the IDF's actions the other week, isn't there a larger positive moral argument for the use of Jewish power to protect Jewish lives? Rather than cower from charges of disproportionate killing, Shouldn't friends of the Jewish state remember the consequences of Jewish powerlessness in the long history of anti-Jewish aggression? Recently, I sat down with Elliott Abrams, senior fellow at the Council on Foreign Relations, former Deputy National Security Advisor in the George W. Bush administration, and author, most recently, of Realism and Democracy from Cambridge University Press. The point of departure for our conversation is a piece Elliott published on his CFR blog, Pressure Points, entitled Hamas and Gaza. If you enjoyed this conversation, you can subscribe to Kikar on iTunes and Stitcher, or find us on YouTube. And if you want to learn more about our work at the Jewish Leadership Conference, you can visit jewishleadershipconference.org and follow us on Facebook and Twitter. Here now is my conversation with Elliott Abrams. Elliott Abrams, welcome to Kikar.
Thank you.
So I thought we'd just begin with the blog post that you wrote on Hamas and Gaza, in which you lay out the escalation over time that, as a strategy, Hamas has taken to try and infiltrate and disrupt and threaten Israel. Help us refresh our memory.
Hamas took over Gaza in 2007 by force of arms, and there then began first lots of rockets and missiles. This has been going on now for 11 years. And they thought they would be able to change Israeli behavior, perhaps force people to move out of the south of Israel near the border. But the Israelis used their high-tech prominence and prowess to invent all sorts of missile defense and rocket defenses, Iron Dome, to shoot down those rockets. So that actually, it's not a perfect solution, but it's a pretty good solution. Hamas then had another secret that we didn't know about way back then, which was tunnels. They have tunnels into Egypt, or had, mostly for smuggling people, smuggling weapons, also smuggling contraband, which Hamas then taxed. But they had big tunnels into Israel. The idea was to be able to put terrorists in who could capture, kidnap Israelis, bring them back to Gaza, or simply shoot up, blow up kibbutzim, farms, schools. And that was more troublesome for the Israelis, and they searched for a technical response, and they have found one, and are building a kind of underground wall, which Hamas is really not going to be able to go under. And they also have ground-penetrating radar and other ways of finding these tunnels. So Hamas had another idea, which we have seen most recently, and that is, let's send masses of people to the border to overrun the fences and get into Israel. And some of those people will be armed Hamas terrorists who will blow things up, again, who will terrorize and kill and kidnap Israelis. And of course, what we saw last week was Israel's iron determination to prevent that, and they did prevent it. The number of Hamas terrorists or Gazan citizens who got into Israel was 0. So if I were a Hamas leader, I would, I think, be wondering, well, what do we do now?
It's a good question. I mean, you do see a strategy which at every turn is intended to appeal as much to global opinion for the purpose of portraying Gazans and Israelis in certain ways in the media, more than as a military strategy.
I think that's right. It shows you that the leaders of Hamas view the citizens as cannon fodder who are useful for the global media strategy. And from that point of view, Hamas leaders are happy when people die because they think it looks good on European TV screens. And it gets worse in the sense that when they're digging tunnels, that doesn't really affect the mass population of Gaza. When they're shooting rockets, it does in the sense that you know that Israel is going to strike back and some innocent people are bound to be hurt. But now the storming the fence, you can't do that with 25 Hamas guys. That's mobilizing the population. They had 40,000 people last week at one point, to turn them directly into targets, to convert them really into sacrifices for Hamas's media strategy.
And how would you describe the purpose of the strategy? It's a strategy designed to do what exactly?
Two things. First, directly to try to intimidate the Israelis into doing less. So, for example, had they not done what they did at the border, it's perfectly plausible that masses of people would have gotten over that fence, through the fence, and into Israel. The larger point, though, I think, is it's an international political strategy, and the goal is to get particularly European countries to boycott Israel, to criticize Israel, to break with Israel, to withdraw their ambassadors from Israel. And then you circle back because they're hopeful that if that happens, at least some voices in Israel will begin to say, well, we need to change our tactics. We can't do that. Cost-benefit analysis. So the hope is that they can use these tactics to stop Israel from defending itself.
You know, one of the most eagerly accepted lines of reporting that came out of Gaza, I say reporting, I shouldn't even use that term because, of course, it was merely journalists accepting the figures from Hamas HQ. But one of the most triumphantly reported figures coming out of Gaza was that Israel had wounded hundreds and 1,000 citizens of Gaza and had murdered 60 Gazan citizens. The IDF tried to defend itself by saying, well, many of those were terrorists. Many of those were actually Hamas operatives, to which a senior Hamas leader went on Palestinian television and disputed the figure. It wasn't 30. 50 of them were Hamas operatives. Why would he say that?
That's a very interesting question because at first glance you'd say, oh, he should have said 0 were Hamas militants. Why say that? Because it strengthens the Israeli argument that they were actually shooting at terrorists. So why make the argument? I believe the answer is that there is internal criticism in Gaza. There is criticism from Palestinian citizens. You are turning us into cannon fodder. You are sacrificing the lives of men, women, and children for your political goals. And the Hamas defense was, no. Those are our guys the Israelis were shooting at. They weren't shooting indiscriminately. So it has hurt their international media strategy, but it's very interesting because it shows their tactics actually have met with criticism and resistance internally in Gaza.
That's a hopeful sign.
It is a hopeful sign. Look, it's, to say it's not a democracy is, of course, obvious. So what is public opinion? It's extremely difficult to measure. They don't do normal opinion polls, and they certainly don't have elections. This is one of those rare signs, I think, that there is such a thing as public opinion in Gaza. There is such a thing as society, and that not everybody in it thinks it's a great idea to send kids and to send families to the border to court danger.
So if you're trying to inhabit the mindset of now an Israeli leader, say the Minister of Defense or the Prime Minister, as those gentlemen are thinking about how to defend the border, they also are cognizant that they're sending signals to adversaries and allies alike. How do you think that the Prime Minister and Israeli leadership think about what Syria is seeing at the Hamas border, or what Iran is seeing at the Gaza border?
I think narrowly what they're seeing is that Israel's willing to fight to defend its borders, so you're not going to get away with trying to overrun them anywhere. Not from the West Bank, not from Syria, not from Gaza. But more broadly, I think what they're seeing is determination. They're seeing that even with the bad publicity in Europe or anywhere else, even with denunciations at the UN, Israel is determined to protect its security. So when they say, for example, we will not permit Iran to establish itself in Syria as it has in Lebanon, I believe the message is to be taken seriously, because what happened at the Gaza border with very broad, in fact, I would say almost unanimous Israeli public support, is a sign of national will and national determination to protect the country.
It might be too strong to use the word obligation, but do you think that Israel has an incentive based on its own interests to try and improve the economic life and the well-being of citizens inside of Gaza?
I do. There are a couple of ways of explaining this in narrow self-interest terms, and the best one is probably if there's no electricity flowing to Gaza, the sewage treatment plants there don't work. Raw sewage is flowing into the Mediterranean, and it tends to flow north up to Israeli beaches. Well, so it's in Israel's interest to prevent that. More broadly, I don't see how mass misery in Gaza is really in Israel's interest. One could theorize, yeah, it is, because then Palestinians will get fed up. They'll overthrow Hamas. Hamas is a Islamist terrorist group, well armed by Iran. They're not going to overthrow it. So then the question really is, well, do we want people to live in misery? Is it possible that if there is more electricity, more water, more opportunity to travel, say, to Egypt or even to the West Bank. Is it possible that in order to preserve that, Hamas will be less likely to try another round of violence? I think that's actually the prevailing view in Israel. There are other views. This is an enemy country. In effect, let's treat it like an enemy country. But it's not actually a country at all. And I think it is smarter for Israel and Egypt to figure out ways to prevent mass misery there that is more likely, I think, to lead to more violence against Israel than any other outcome.
Of course, even that path is lined with its own dangers and perils. One of the examples that you bring up in the blog post from the other day is the case of cement, in which Israel had allowed for lots of cement to go into Gaza with the purpose of building hospitals and schools and residential homes. And that cement all of a sudden turned up underground to fortify tunnels.
Yeah, we don't think of cement as a dual-use item that can be turned into a weapon, but in the hands of Hamas, it has been. You know, there's no magic formula here, but many things can go in: food, medical supplies. And by the way, in the immediate aftermath of the confrontations, Israel was in fact sending medical supplies into Gaza. I mean, partly it's just because it's a civilized, decent country, and they do not enjoy seeing people suffer. But I don't think there's any way around this conundrum that some of what goes into Gaza will be stolen and diverted by Hamas. What you can try to do is keep the amount down and prevent Hamas from making great leaps forward on armaments.
You know, the premise of this conversation, and I think the moral challenge that we confront when we look at a regime like Hamas, is that they evince just no sense of obligation to their own citizens. They don't protect their own citizens. In America, we tend to think that governments are constituted among men to protect certain rights, and we see the inversion of that, you know, entirely in the case of Hamas in Gaza. On the other side, in Israel, I wonder how you think about Israel's responsibility to its own citizens and whether it has a kind of larger moral purpose or larger moral ends are served in the use of Jewish power to defend Jewish lives.
It has been shocking, though maybe not surprising, to see some of the commentary in Europe saying that the Israelis used disproportionate force. Clearly, that would not be said if people had gotten through the border and killed 60 Israelis. We've seen this before in European comments about disproportionate use of force. Israel's obligation, and it is the obligation of every government, every normal, decent, civilized government to its population, is to defend them, and particularly to defend them from foreign attack, from terrorist attack, which is what the government of Israel did here with complete success. So it is a very odd moral calculus that criticizes the government of Israel, in essence, because no Israelis were killed. Israel's purpose here is a pretty narrow one. There are people on the other side of that border who are announcing their plans to kill and kidnap Israelis as part of their larger project, which they also are very clear about, to destroy the state of Israel, to bring it to an end. So I can hardly think of an obligation that is more important practically and morally for the government of the state of Israel than preventing precisely those outcomes.
I always like to ask guests, what do you like to read to learn about Israeli security and what's happening in both the West Bank and in Gaza?
Let me give 3 answers. There are 2 columnists I follow. One of them, Alex Fishman, and you can Google it and follow his stuff in translation, who's probably the leading military columnist. Yoaz Hendel, Hendel, who's a more general purpose columnist, but covers also these kinds of issues that we've been discussing today. And finally, I'd say sign up for the Institute for National Security Studies, INSS, which publishes a constant flow of papers, monographs on security issues in Israel. You know, get on the list, you'll get them by email, and it's a very good way to keep up to date with papers covering the evolution of Israel's security challenges.
This conversation was recorded on May 18th. Elliott Abrams, thank you for joining us.
Been my pleasure.